This is lesson 3 in domain 10, and the title for this lesson is called The Shot Heard Around the World. At the end of this lesson, you're going to have 2 different objectives. You'll be able to accomplish 2 different tasks. The first one is you'll be able to explain Paul Revere's ride. It's a very important ride that has a lot of meaning behind it. And you're also going to be able to identify Minutemen and Redcoats. Our last lesson, we talked about 2 different groups called the Loyalists and the Patriots and how they were separate groups of people and how we can identify them with different identifying factors. It's going to be the same idea with the Minutemen and the Redcoats. These are going to be 2 different distinct groups of people that we're able to tell apart with different aspects about them. So you're going to be able to explain Paul Revere's ride, and you'll be able to identify Minutemen and Redcoats. Now, before we get started, like always, we do have some vocabulary for this reading. The first one is belfry, a tower that holds a large bell inside. Militia, an army made up of ordinary people, not trained soldiers. Obeyed, that means to follow orders, or you did something that someone told you to do. Signal, an object or act used to send message without words. Spies, people who secretly keep watch on other people to find out information about what's happening. And the last one is volunteers, people who do something without being paid or told to do it. So after the Boston Tea Party, King George sent thousands of British soldiers to Boston to make sure the colonists obeyed the king's orders. They swarmed the streets of the city in their fancy red uniforms with shiny buttons, earning themselves the name of Redcoats. They're these men right here. They carried weapons with them everywhere they went. This made the people of Boston very angry. The city no longer felt like home to them. They did not know whom to trust. Spies spread all over the city. British soldiers disguised as colonists, and colonists disguised as British soldiers. There was a lot of whispering in the streets as people kept secrets from one another. It was not a very pleasant place to live, and it was even a little scary. Paul Revere was a silversmith living in Boston. As a silversmith, he was kept quite busy making and repairing silver dinnerware, candlesticks, and jewelry. A sign with a silver pitcher hung outside his shop on the town square. One day, the door to his shop flew open, and a friend rushed over to Revere's side. The 2 men were both members of the Sons of Liberty, the group of patriots who had emptied tea into the Boston's harbor. And we can remember from last reading, patriots were the people who did not want to be British citizens anymore. They wanted to be their own citizens. They wanted to be American citizens. Ever since the Boston Tea Party, the colonists of Massachusetts had been hiding weapons, gunpowder, and cannonballs in neighboring towns. The British, afraid that the colonists might be planning to attack them, captured these weapons whenever they learned where they were hidden. Now, as the 2 men huddled together in the back of Revere's shop, his friend whispered that the British were planning to raid the colonists' storehouse of weapons in the town of Concord. The British were to travel that night, he said, but nobody knew whether they would march there by land or they would choose the shorter route and sail on a boat by sea. The patriots knew they must somehow warn the militia in Concord. Revere asked a friend to spy on the British and to discover the soldiers' plans. Then he arranged for a signal to be given, a secret code, to let him know the answer to his question. His friend was to climb up the bell tower of the Old North Church, light one lantern and hang it in the belfry if the British are traveling on foot by land, Revere told his friend. But if they are traveling on a boat by sea, hang 2 lanterns. So we had 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. That night, after dark, Paul Revere left his family and crept down to the banks of the Charles River. He quietly rowed his boat across the river to a spot where fellow patriots waited with a horse, saddled and ready to go. Mounting the horse, Paul Revere watched the church, waiting patiently for the signal. It wasn't long before he spotted a light in the tower. 1 light, then 2, Ah, he said to himself, just as I thought. They've chosen the quickest way, by water, where fewer people are apt or able to see them. Then I shall go by land, arriving before they do. Tipping his hat in thanks, thanks to the patriots, he sped away. As he galloped through the towns along the way, Revere shouted to the colonists in their bed, "The redcoats are coming! The redcoats are coming!" All around him, shutters were thrown open as people began waking in the middle of the night. When Revere reached the town of Lexington with word of the approaching British troops, men hurried from their homes, joining one another with their muskets in the middle of the town. These men, known as minute men because they were expected to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, slept with their muskets and gunpowder beside their beds. So we were just introduced to Minutemen. At dawn, the British reached Lexington. The Minutemen were farmers and shopkeepers, volunteers for their country, not trained soldiers. They looked ragged next to the well-dressed British soldiers, or redcoats. In the confusion of the early morning hours, a shot was fired. Others fired back, and fighting continued throughout the morning. Finally, Minutemen were able to force the British to return to Boston, firing at them from behind rocks, trees, and fences all along the way. To this day, no one knows who fired the first shot that day. Nerves had been on edge since the Boston Tea Party, so it is not surprising that guns went off. The first shot was the beginning of a long war between the British and their American colonies. It is now known as the shot heard round the world, because not only did it change life in the colonies, but it also changed things around the world in Great Britain, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. That long war became known as the Revolutionary War. Could it be that the shot heard round the world rang out so loudly from the Massachusetts colony that it actually reached King George's ears that April morning? What do you think? So we were just introduced to Paul Revere's Ride. It was so important because that Minutemen militia had to be ready to fight the redcoats that were coming into town. And without Paul Revere's Ride, they would not have been ready and they would not have been prepared. So that's why Paul Revere's Ride is so important. He rode on horseback throughout the colonies and into Lexington so he can tell them that the British redcoats are coming and to prepare for that battle that's about to happen. And we were also introduced to two different types of people, two different groups of people. We had the redcoats that were from Britain. They were British. They were British soldiers. So that means they were trained in battle. They were trained in combat, and they were very, very nicely dressed. They had nice, clean pressed red coats, which is why they got that red coat name. And they had those shiny boots, and everything was in order. And then we had the Minutemen. The Minutemen were volunteers and shopkeepers. They were not trained soldiers, and they were colonists. And they were trained to get ready at a minute's notice, which is why they were called Minutemen. And they were volunteers in the colonies that wanted to fight against the British redcoats in order to try to gain their freedom. And between Paul Revere's Ride and the Minutemen and the redcoats fighting each other in that shot heard around the world, that is what started the Revolutionary War that eventually led to the independence of the American colonies, and that led to our nation that we know today. So your goal at the end of this lesson was to be able to describe the importance of Paul Revere's Ride and to be able to explain the difference between Minutemen and redcoats. So if you need a review of anything, please go back in this video and do that now. Once you are finished, return to Seesaw and do the activity that accompanies this lesson.